Hello, everyone, and welcome to my show, Immutable. I have a couple of thank yous up front. First of all, thank you to all of my professors who have helped me on this journey for over the 4 years that I've been here. I want to thank Joelle specifically for getting me into digital art. You're going to see tons of that and pushing that. I want to thank Court for being Spitzka's biggest fan. I would like to thank Katie for all of her, instructions with documentation and helping me facilitate as professional of a show as I can present. And I want to give a special thank you to Tyler for being the one who sort of inspired me to give greater importance to a lot of the queer narratives that I have created for this show. And then I want to thank Leah, who's on the floor right now, because she put it with so much of me being here late at night and installing this. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to this very important piece called Rest. This was something that I actually created in 2018, but because my show focuses on time and creating an archive of these queer narratives, I wanted to show something that was the starting point of this entire journey. So these are 3 separate plates for a color print that I did with Tyler. And in that moment, he said to me, these characters, they're interesting. You can flesh them out and bring them to life. And ever since that moment, that's what I've been focusing on, is how can I make these characters tangible, even though they are not real narratives. They are invented and inspired by history. And from these metal plates and traditional printmaking methods, I graduated to something a little bigger and a little more modern. This right here is a piece that's called Redressing. It's about a couple set in the Old West and how cross-dressing is a way to sort of facilitate the way that you can present yourself in public. So on the right, we have Damien, who is a very well-dressed and proper man who comes from a very upper-class family, who runs banking, business, capitalism, all that fun stuff. And on the left, we have the persona that he presents in public when he wants to be with his partner, Jacob. Her name is Dahlia. Her race is a prostitute of sorts, because the idea is that being a prostitute is still being seen as a woman, and even though it's a very low level of society, this still gets them relative safety, because sodomy back then was illegal. So this just has a bunch of fun little bits of queer history in it. You can see the repeated motif of the green carnation there, Oscar Wilde, some queer history. And over here, we will return to some more traditional methods of printmaking. On the right, we have the wooden panel that goes to this woodcut. This is a narrative set in 19th century France. The idea here is right after slavery was made illegal there and slaves were freed. We have narratives of intersectional and across the bridges and culture here. Jonathan is actually blind. So in this instance, the motif plays on how skin is not important to love, even though that is what everybody else sees and stigmatizes. And in this way, Clement becomes his eyes to the world. And because texture is really important to these characters, I decided to display the wood panel because of all of these gouges and marks and the action of cutting that sort of goes to the history of this couple. And we will move on. This is another piece of Jonathan and Clement. In this case, I wanted to touch on aspects of queer futurity, specifically the idea that from the common perspective, people who are queer don't have lives outside of the small existence that they will have. There's no sense of family or endurance or lineage. In this case, I wanted to encapsulate that moment through ephemeral materials, like this cloth that you can vaguely see through when you approach the piece, the way lights hit it, this tender moment, knowing that Jonathan, as you can see with the pointed ears, is a vampire who is going to endure and live forever, and the way that love is going to last in this moment while he lays his partner to rest. Moving on to a more modern couple, you can see these ideas of contamination, the hospital being a very eerie place and a place where boundaries are broken. This character, Riley, they're born intersex, and though you can't see it from this distance away, there is a hospital tag that reads sex female. And this is supposed to sort of encapsulate the ideas of the way that hospital can violate the boundaries of a person who identifies as something that is non-binary and off of the spectrum, and the ways that people are like, oh, this is a gender thing? This can be biological too. So the idea that you can ignore these things completely as sort of like, the structure of society, that's not quite how that works. And the idea that these cats are like clawing and taking away this patterned garb that sort of hides the body is once again sort of homage to that violation. Moving on to the final couple in this series of queer stories. This is set in the 1950s. It is a piece titled Nuclear Family, spelled N-E-W, as opposed to the nuclear family that we would think of, which is the typical housewife, the man who's going out and getting all the money, and then the child. So in this space, we see a queer couple in a very intimate setting, closed off in bed with their child, and they're happy. And the idea that this space is something sort of sacred, because while it may not be a huge societal change, for the queer narrative, it is the personal story that is being changed for something that is very meaningful and important to this couple. Now, with all these digital prints, I had to include one more in the tripartite of printmaking that I have done and explored in the physical sphere, once again returning to Jonathan and Clement. On the bottom row, you'll see the transparencies that were used to make these screen prints, which once again sort of goes to show the ephemerality and the temporal nature of these works. This particular series, which is the actual screen print, each different edition is sort of a strange take and alteration on the narrative itself. Here we have one that is sort of being defaced and broken apart. So this idea of the chain link fence that is separating the character from you or the character from his partner, that's being destroyed. Here we have one where it's raised off the surface and more pronounced. So the way that these characters are perceived, the clothing, the objects that are associated with them, all of those are important to the narrative. Because first, what you read about a person before you even know their story is the way that they look. And the final piece that I want to highlight in this exhibit is an animation that I did, which is composed of 2 layers. One is Riley at the scene of an injury, bleeding out in the subway, and this idea that there are tons of people walking by. You can't see them, but you are a part of this space, and you are sort of being invited in to this person's pain, the brutality that happens against queer people. What are you going to do about it? The screen sort of represents that space where you don't feel like you can do anything, but this sort of spotlight effect goes to show the way that investigators can violate the body in an attempt to identify someone, as opposed to them speaking to their own identity. And the eyes are intended to challenge that viewer. So overall, this is a narrative that spans everywhere from the 19th century up to present day with pieces like this. And if you come in and check out the gallery, if you're physically on campus and can do that, you'll see a couple of accessory pieces that build on these larger narratives. So thank you. And I will take questions.
We have our first question. Why is time important to your work, and how do the relationships differ based on the historic time?
So time is important for me because time calls into questions how things change. While they are set in their own time periods, it is looking back on them that can potentially change the way that queer history is viewed as a whole. So for example, if you just look at the Old West, that's going to be a completely different culture. Things like dancing were a way that homosocial spaces could promote these male relationships. Something like in Old France, you have the salons. Clement does art restoration and antique collecting. And that was a space where, queers could sort of get into that practice of arts and the culture together. Something more modern, we have conflicts of, transgender identity, which is pertinent to Isaac and Riley's story that you saw in the hospital piece. So each of these characters exists within a time period, but also a broader narrative. And I think that when you narrow your focus and pull it back, there's something interesting that's revealed there. And the reason that my show is called Immutable is for this way that fluidity of time meshes with fluidity of sexuality and gender. So immutable is something that cannot be changed. They have core identities in and of themselves. But when you break it down to mutable, or I'm mutable, it comes to the ability to change with time, the ways the story is further being understood, the way that identities are being facilitated from that perspective. And the little colon in the center is supposed to show how time is written. So like on a clock, that sort of breaks it up and is an allusion to that further.
And could you explain the importance in the piece after the nuclear family with Spitska looking at itself in the mirror?
Of course. So this one was actually inspired by a class that I took many, many years ago called Queer Russia. And it specifically looked at the different stories, historical as well as things in the cinema that talked about queer life. And though you can't see it, it's very faint. This is something you have to experience in person. When he's cutting his hair in the mirror to show that change from this feminine style where he played a motherly role to nurture his sister to one that's going to be more militaristic, in the portrait hanging above is Nadezhda Dorova, also known as the Cavalry Maiden, and she essentially followed the same story as Spitska, where although she was like brought up female, she went into the military in place of her father. She was very independent. She fought with these soldiers and she documented all of her experiences in the military. And so sort of this connection between real figures and then a character that I made up is sort of a way to allude to the fact that these are grounded in reality, they're made up, but you can still empathize with this experience.
And what are your fashion and pattern inspirations?
Ooh. Okay, so things with Clement are particularly inspired by a Belgian artist called Stromae. He does a lot of like music choreography and particularly a lot of that patterned work. Yinka Shonibare, who also exhibited here a while ago, was a good fashion inspiration for that. When it comes to Damien specifically, I did a lot of research into like the China Poblana, which was sort of like the garb of the time that a lot of Mexican people wore. In some pieces, I have integrated that sort of cultural element with like the corset that prostitutes wore, just to further allude to the fact that he has like this dual role where it is his, you know, ethnic identity that is sometimes salient, sometimes it is a gender that is salient, and how those two intersect.
Well, I personally have a question. As a fellow
Sure.
studio art major, I've seen you work on your characters and the character development. I was wondering if there was one specifically that matured or blossomed unexpectedly for you, or something that you hold dearly.
Oh, this is hard because I love all of them, and all of them are like works that are created out of love. They're a constant project that's happening with my partner, Caitlin, who I hope is somewhere in here. But we've worked together to build these stories over time. So they are always changing. They've been constantly growing and constantly being elaborated on. I would say that in my time here at Davidson, Riley and Isaac were a very recent culmination, the one that is off to the wall in the hospital. They were a recent endeavor that actually blossomed kind of out of this pandemic contamination type of culture, and the way Chernobyl and radiation sort of go with that. So I'd say that they've been a particularly exciting project that I've been working on with my partner.
And how have the different media influenced your art, and what topics or themes did you utilize them for?
All right, so I think the printmaking, traditional printmaking, I would argue that all of my work is printmaking to some degree, but the more traditional pieces ground me in history because they are things that from the start are held physically. They are objects that I'm touching and leaving my imprint on. With the plates, I didn't bother polishing them up because part of it is the idea that they are being handled as these characters have been handled and interacted with other humans. I also think that with the woodcut specifically, there is an element of not necessarily violence, but there's pushback from the material I'm working with. It's not as clean cut as the digital pieces, but the digital pieces are important for me because I can do them in a more intimate setting. It's almost private and tender the ways that I can use my hand to go over those, and it's clean and there's an element of control. And for me to use a style that is probably more akin to an illustrator, it allows these like heavier concepts to be digested in a way that isn't terrifying, although these pieces are huge to show the importance of every single story that I'm telling in the larger narrative. So I think they serve two separate purposes that facilitate the same end goal.
Could you speak more about your decisions of scale in this collection? And are you considering scale as an emphasis of some sort?
Yes, scale is most certainly an emphasis. I think that came mostly out of the piece of Damien and Jacob on this wall, because for me, when I was working with it, it felt so small and important. But when I showed this to the class, people are like, I feel like this is a figure I should know. And so to show that through scale, where you can approach these from a distance and it's like it pulls you in, you want to know more because the scale itself is something that says, I'm important, look at me. And you are going to look at this when you come into the gallery because it just holds your attention. As for the smaller pieces, I do think they have an element of intimacy, but it's really the big pieces that get you into the gallery and get you into knowing these characters before you go to the intimate, smaller works. So I feel like they sort of piggyback off each other, but I don't think I could have the intimate pieces and smaller scale without the larger one, if that makes sense. I feel like I need a gateway to open my work to people. That's a statement.
And more on those decisions, is there a way that the light plays in this exhibition?
I'd say there's only one piece that light was really critical for, and that is probably, well, actually two. These ones, you can probably just shoot right through. In this one with the copper plates, the way that the lighting is focused, if you move from side to side, the plates actually glisten and reflect onto the display case, which is just something that's almost, I don't even know how to describe it. It's just fantastic to see because it sort of shows my fascination with all of these stories because it's something that's, it seems pristine, but when you go under the surface, there are these nitty gritty, violent things that can happen to these people. And then this one specifically, the light is sort of cast through some of this fabric to show the way that, like if I had hung it any lower, his face would have been, covered. But the idea that you can pull back on a moment and it reveals more is something that I played with the light and the actual depth of the fabric in ways that really wasn't happening in other pieces.
So, which narrative do you think you illustrated best?
Oh, Lord, that is quite a question. Mayhaps the lighting question could have also pertained to not just the lighting in the gallery, but the lighting in the pieces. The reason that this is sort of backlit is to show that there's like a pure space that most people would consider, like queer people are a disease on a society. So there's like this motif of, like I'm with AIDS, this idea of like spreading something with your identity. So the fact that only his head in the protective suit and their finger just breach this space of light is the idea that it's a restriction of being able to pass into a certain place. With the work of Spitzka that you guys saw earlier in the corner, light in that way is sort of getting you to enter into this space. It was my first sort of exploration with the idea that you yourself as the viewer are approaching the moment. It's supposed to sort of be like you were the one who opened the door to see him doing this, and you're casting light on what would have been a private moment that might have not been seen. And I sort of think that light functions the same way in this piece of Riley over here, which is one of the accessory pieces to the story. Again, backlit to sort of show this ambiance. It's an allusion to time, even though this is an indoor space. This is taking place at night. And right up here in the corner, where it's a little less illuminated, you see that Isaac is entering the space. And Riley is not actually looking at you, but is looking past you to the person who's entering. So how you are integrated into this space, I think light is something that played an important role for me there. As for, I believe the last question was, which narrative did I illustrate best? I would say probably Spitzka and Joseph, which was the nuclear family one. Spitzka was the one over there. And there's also an accessory piece here because Spitska, he is obviously not human, and he technically spans the entire length of time that all of these characters are alive. So I think he has a lot of versatility, especially in the way that he transcends both time and in his identity, and how that's changed so much depending on his location, whether that was in Russia or in America where he meets Joseph.
Do you envision these works culminating into a series of graphic novels?
If I got the time, I would so love to be able to do that because I feel like I can't cram enough of a story into a single piece, which is why when I guess people enter this space, they're like, wow, there's so much work. And I think it feels empty to me almost because this is only a small portion of what I actually want to be showing of their stories. So hopefully in the future, I would be able to turn these into actual graphic novels.
And how did you come up with the titles or names for these works or your characters?
Some of them, I suppose, are a little open-ended in terms of concept. This one is called I Am, and it's supposed to be this idea of like the pronouns changing depending on identity. The larger piece, which is called Redressing, the one of Damien and Jacob, that was actually inspired by a novel that I read under the same title, which is Redressing the Stories of Transgender and Cross-Dressing on the Frontier. So specifically, that was an allusion to a historical reference. The rest are sort of all things that I've come up with myself where they are a play on words, like the nuclear family being nuclear. It's reshaping what the family structure can look like in a time when that was probably not acceptable. So I think it's a certain allusion to either how the characters relate to each other, how they conceptualize themselves, or allusions to actual historical things.
So when you were just talking about the two pieces, you talked about them being accessory pieces. Could you elaborate more on that?
So the idea for my show was that I wanted to have 4 large pieces that, as best as they could, encompassed an entire narrative for these characters. And so you'll see things that I guess encompass the way that the characters more relate to each other, as opposed to how they might relate in society. So I guess they're individualized to those characters, and the accessory pieces sort of give a glimpse into an individual character in a way. Like this one focuses on Spitska, but the nuclear family one focuses on Joseph Spitska and their daughter. So I guess the accessory pieces show them as they relate to each other, and the individual ones sort of elaborate on a single side of my story because, again, I'm only half of the contributor to these narratives, even though I created everything in this show visually. So I want there to be space for, my partner to say what they want to. All right, well, thank you guys for coming to this show. It's about out of time. The gallery will be open until April 11th. So swing by whenever you want to see these if you can. I'll be happy if any of you want like an individual tour to talk about some of these pieces or the narratives of the characters. Just get in contact with me and I will be happy to talk for hours. Yes. Oh my goodness. Oh, there's Raven. Hi, Raven. Oh my goodness. My partner. Hi. This is awesome. Thank you guys for coming. Oh, I see my grandma. Well, not see her, but I know she's there. Hi, grandma. My eyes.